Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ruby live event office hours with Chef Ken Rubin. I am Chef Ken Rubin, the Chief Culinary Officer here at Ruby Online Culinary School. And just really excited to welcome you today to these open office hours at this live event. This is a time when Ruby students from all around the world come together, regardless of what class they're in, and are able to engage me on any question they have around culinary, any topics around cooking or cooking technique, how to use ingredients. Sometimes we even talk a little bit about some things around nutrition or some things around agriculture. But really, these office hours are intended to support you on your pathway to learning with us. So if you have never used our office hours or visited our office hours before, and you want to ask a question, you can very easily just type a question in that top empty box right to the top right of where you see me speaking. Click the black add button. If you want to have that moderated, it goes into a moderation queue that you can see also to the right-hand side. When you see a question that you like, press on that little heart next to it, and that will pop that question up just a little bit more so I get to it faster. Again, really excited to have you join us. If you have any questions whatsoever, or if a follow-up question is needed, feel free to add it in there as well. Just one note, if I see a question that I feel is just better answered more personally, if it's more of a individual question, we might just contact you more directly versus in this this forum. This very first question here: what is the difference between brewer's yeast, and nutritional yeast? Are they interchangeable in whole food plant-based cooking? So those are very different products, not interchangeable. Brewer's yeast, as the name implies, is a yeast that is used in brewing. It's also highly nutritional from a B vitamin perspective. Nutritional yeast is very common in plant-based cooking because of the sort of cheesy or kind of the kind of sweet and sour flavor, this kind of depth, umami type flavor that it has. People use it to add a tanginess or kind of a cheesy flavor to various foods like salad dressings or vinaigrettes or dips or spreads. Some people put it on popcorn, add it to sauces and things to give kind of a depth of flavor. So they're not interchangeable. They have much different flavor profiles. Typically in plant-based cooking, we're talking about nutritional yeast being used for flavor development, whereas brewer's yeast is additive more for nutritional or B vitamin enhancement. Next question, Linda says, please help with meal planning versus dish planning. I am new at this and need help. So Linda, great question. I think there's an important distinction there. So when you're thinking about, making a full meal of various parts, various components, it's a much different, topic. It's a much different exercise than just thinking through how to make one dish or how to make, a side dish or something like that. So, when I think about building a meal and building out a set of meals over the course of a week, the planning really comes down to me around batch cooking. I always try to stay 2 or 3 days ahead. I've got busy life, kids, family, the whole bit around not having time. So really, when I think about what am I going to eat tomorrow, what are my 3 meals, what are my snacks, I'm thinking multiple days. So batch cooking is going to be really, really important for you. Thinking through, I've got this meal in mind. It involves 2 different beans and a green. It's going to be a soup. I'm going to put some dumplings in it or whatever it might be. And that's going to have a list of components. Those components are going to have certain requirements in terms of when they might be prepped or how long they can stay in a prepped or semi-prepped state before they need to be cooked. And you basically go through the process, thinking it through. So if it's a soup or a stew or a braise, what are those things that the morning of you can pre-cut or you can cut the day before and just put in a container And that way on the day of, it's one step that you don't have to do, right? So planning those things out would be really, really important. The other part of the meal planning is kind of what goes together. For me, it's why I always try to stay a few steps ahead by having just a reserve of things that I've batch cooked previously, either in the freezer or in the fridge. Very oftentimes they're not finished or they're not adorned. So I have just, simply steamed vegetables or simply roasted vegetables that I can then add some more specific flavor to later on. That's fine. But also about I want to have an abundance of things. One of the ways I help to get my kids to eat a variety is just to have options. So, what might have been the primary side dish, last night, say it was roasted cauliflower and broccoli or something, might be a smaller component of another dish the next night. So I might take that leftover broccoli and cauliflower that I roasted, and I could, take the whole florets or the big pieces of florets, and I can cut it small, and it becomes a component in a veggie fried rice dish or something like that, right? So I'm just finding ways to repurpose, but still keeping it interesting. The other thing, Linda, I'll just suggest in terms of meal planning is really also about what are those things that build flavor. I've referenced earlier how oftentimes I'll do a batch cooking technique on a bean or a grain or a vegetable and not apply a very robust flavor to it, knowing that I'm going to augment that with something else, and finding those things that build flavor that I can add that really make them stand out and, kind of signify that they're unique is also really key. So it might be, a smoky or spicy salsa. It might be a creamy tahini dressing made from sesame and, some chives or some garlic or something in there. So finding those things that also build and add flavor in a very unique and distinct way that's going to be really important. Jill asks, once my course is over, will I still be able to access the recipes that I bookmarked? Jill, so yeah, you'll have access to the recipes and clicking into video lessons and things, so you can view those, moving forward. So what I recommend is, keep those bookmarked, but also, maybe keep an open mind to using the course to learn some new recipes, maybe things that you didn't do on your first pass. So yeah, good luck in there. Congratulations. Hello, Chef Ken. Thanks for your time. Wondering if you can recommend a brand or two of shallow roasting pan. I have purchased a couple, but they buckle even at lower oven temperature most of the time. They look sturdy and solid, but I would say when it comes to shallow roasting pans, I've never really had issues around buckling or things like that, because I'm buying typically just kind of heavier weight stainless steel pans. I know I have an all-clad roasting pan that I've had for nearly 20 years. That's not too large. It's maybe a 9x13 or thereabouts in terms of its size, 9 inches by 13 inches. It's also maybe about 2 inches deep. So, fairly shallow roasting pan, good for roasting veggies and things like that, or, doing like a lasagna or a casserole or something like that works fine in there. One of the things I'll recommend if you're just doing a lot of roasting and are having issues with buckling, I would say, one of the very best things you could use for most roasting applications are just sheet pans, half sheet pans. And as long as you're buying a decent quality sheet pan at the restaurant supply store, they're going to be a little bit more expensive than like a lighter weight sheet pan. But I've had sheet pans that were fairly inexpensive, call it $15, last for years and years without any buckling at all. So just maybe check out the restaurant supply store. Robert, if you need any suggestions, you can contact us directly. But even online, you should be able to find those for pretty pretty good price. Shouldn't be more than about $15 or $20 each at the most. If you were to go in to and buy one, they should be even less than that for sure. Next question here coming in. How can I cook without oil? Great question. It's actually something very topical. We have a lot of students who join us here at Ruby via our Forks Over Knives partner or via our Culinary RX partner, both which have components of learning to cook without oil. This is super important for people who have health concerns, people with cardiac health concerns in particular. There's been some recent research and science around the inflammatory response that oil can cause people, and reduction of oil or the use of just naturally occurring fats in foods versus oils has definitely gotten a lot of traction. So there's a few things that one could do when you're learning to cook without oil, and these are in depth explained in, say, our Forks Over Knives course, which you might recommend. You might take. I could recommend that if you haven't seen that. The basic premise is that you're going to apply a lot of the same types of techniques, but just without the oil. And of course, that changes how you apply the technique. It changes the outcome and so on. So one approach would be, how do you cook food in a pan without oil? How do you get onions, going from a raw chopped state to a state that has color and flavor, and you've seen a transformation of texture? And that's all very possible without oil by cooking it in a hot pan, by using stock, a vegetable stock, or even just plain water if you don't have stock, to essentially flash the pan and kind of create that release of the onions from the bottom of the pan, because they might stick a little bit, but also all that flavor that's developing through that direct contact with the onions in the pan. In the case of using a roasting technique without oil, you would just simply put vegetables in the oven, having had applied maybe a light coating of some additional other flavors. So I would use just a little bit of vinegar that's been reduced perhaps to bring out some of the sweetness. I've also done vinegar reductions with just a little bit of fruit juice, again, to bring out some of the sweetness, enhance the browning potential, and things like that. It also helps with adherence of herbs or spices or whatever else you might want to coat those vegetables with. So those are just two examples. There's lots of ways to reduce or eliminate oil otherwise in baked goods and lots of other cooking techniques. So just a little bit of a sense there for you. Next question here, similar. I'd like to learn how to roast vegetables and potatoes in the oven without using oil or fat. So yeah, very much like I just described, I would say that having your oven at a very high temperature and having your vegetables cut a little bit on the small side, I see great results from that. The smaller cut vegetable definitely cooks faster. Because it cooks faster, you're able to get nice, even browning and crispiness on the outside while still having a nicely cooked, not dry, cooked inside of those potatoes. When I see people roasting vegetables in an oven without oil and the vegetables are very large, number one, because there's no oil, and number two, because they're in the oven for so long, just with dry heat, they have a tendency to get dry versus crispy, right? And what you're going for really is that nice exterior texture, the interior that's cooked and fluffy and soft and all that. But you don't want to. You're not just looking to dehydrate this thing, right? You're not taking all the moisture out. You want to remove some moisture, but all towards the goal of crispy, crunchy exterior without the use of that fat. So, really it's about oven temperature being hot, 425, maybe even 450, cutting your potatoes a little bit smaller than you might ordinarily. Using parchment paper, essential. I would say people talk about using Silpat or other silicone style mats. That's fine if you want to use those. I just use, old-fashioned parchment paper for the non-stick component. They're great, super inexpensive, no transference of any flavor, completely food safe, and so on. So hopefully that helps. I will say one thing real quick about the potatoes is one of the important steps in that process is once you've done the steps of roasting and you've gone through and you've roasted those potatoes, when they're still hot, coming out of the oven, hit them with some additional flavors. That's a great time to stir in a handful of chopped chives or parsley or cilantro, drizzle on some freshly squeezed lemon juice or lime juice. Put some other flavor at that moment when they're really hot. They're ready to absorb some flavor. It also adds some nice vibrancy, some nice color. Great way to kind of finish with flavor there. Next question here from Jill. What tools would you say you use most to embrace this kind of cooking lifestyle? I would say for cooking, I go back to the basics. Always starting with a knife. I would say just a good, chef knife, something that you can use day in and day out that's very sturdy is going to be probably the most important tool that you have. For me, beyond that, there's some other things I'll kind of classify as more in the important gadgets, things with a plug like a high-speed blender that I really love. It's super important when you're making plant-based sauces or you're pureeing something. You just want that texture to be very, very smooth and creamy. I'll also say that, just having some good pans and just the right weight of pan that you feel comfortable working with is going to be really essential. You don't need a lot of pots and pans, but a good 10 or 12 inch saute pan, preferably stainless steel. Doesn't need to be super heavyweight, but a mid-weight pan that you maintain and keep clean and you know how to heat and all those things is going to be really, really important. I would say other things I go to in terms of this, regular cooking. Don't overlook the importance of storage and storage containers. It sounds kind of silly, but a lot of times people forget that they're going to be cooking a lot. They have to have a way to store food in their freezer, in their fridge. It should be, clean and safe and easy to label and all those other things. I've run into so many people who complain about, oh, well, I don't have any place to put my food. I'm putting it into plastic bags or my food goes bad. It's like, well, just, if you make the investment in some storage containers, it'll alleviate all that stress and all those concerns about what you do with leftovers and how do you freeze them and handling them and reheating them and all those other things. Next question, what kind and size of cutting board do you recommend? I typically go for two different kinds of cutting boards. One would be just a natural wood cutting board, which I love and I still use. The pros there is that they're time tested. They're they're easy on your knives. It's just a pleasure to work with when you're applying your cuts on just regular wood. It feels good. The other side of the equation are the synthetics. So either a food grade plastic like a white poly board or any of the food grade composites that kind of look and feel more like wood. They don't look like plastic, but are otherwise hard and not porous and can work really well in terms of the regularity of the process of cleaning and sanitizing and so on. The big thing for me around choosing a cutting board is, about how easy it is to use, how clean. My only one misgiving around wood is that, you need to just make sure that it's maintained well and that it's being washed and dried and that, you don't get any warping or any of those other things that can happen with wood if it's not treated well. The thing about some of those synthetics is that over time they will degrade, so you can't just keep your cutting boards forever. So they need to be replaced, and also they still need to be washed and sterilized and managed. You could still get sick with improperly washed or stored poly cutting boards as well. In terms of size, I I always when I talk about cutting boards, people oftentimes are like, "Wow, I never really thought about it that way." But yeah, that's the way I operate my kitchen. But a lot of people operate a kitchen with one cutting board, and they feel like it's just a one cutting board kitchen. And when the cutting board gets dirty, they have to stop what they're doing and clean the cutting board and then go back to what they were doing. And in my world, I have about 15 cutting boards. I have small ones that I might use just once. I'm just like cutting some garlic to finish something. And it might just be a 4-inch by 6-inch cutting board, a tiny little cutting board. I'm just doing one little thing on. Or I'll break out a 24-inch by 30-inch cutting board that takes up most of the countertop if I'm working on a lot of vegetables. So I think it's good to have a variety of cutting boards. Don't buy one that's too small. Buy a set, buy 3 of them. And that way you don't have to stop what you're doing just to rinse off your cutting board. Have multiple. They're inexpensive. They last a lifetime if they're treated well. Next question here, similar. Is there a particular size cutting board I should look for? Do you recommend a wood cutting board over plastic, or does it not matter? Yeah, I just spent some time talking about that. I don't think it matters. I think you just have to maintain them. And in terms of size, I would say get a few different sizes. Next question here from Betty. I've always soaked beans on countertop. Should I be soaking them in the refrigerator? We RV and have limited space. I know I do not need to soak, but they seem creamier and only take 10 minutes in the Instant Pot. How long is too long to soak them? So when it comes to beans, I would say there's a lot of different schools of thought. I prepare beans really probably 3 different ways. It depends in part on the bean. It also depends on what I'm doing with the bean. If I'm leaving it whole, if I'm pureeing it, if it's going to be just, the star of the show or a minor part of a dish. So I'll think about it and how much time I have sometimes, but I'll think about it from a few different perspectives. Overall, if you have time to soak beans, I would say overall, if you soak them cold, you're going to have maybe slightly better results than soaking them room temperature. The colder soak, I feel, works really well for larger beans where you just don't want to have the soaking happen too quickly, and you can cause some unevenness or some breaking of the skin and things like this. I would say that if you're going to soak, whether it's cold overnight or just a few hours on the countertop, definitely rinsing that water, starting with fresh water to cook in, is going to be preferable. And then, the cooking process from there, whether you use an Instant Pot or pressure cooker or just a stovetop, making sure you have enough water so your beans don't ever dry out, that they have plenty of room to hydrate and swell is going to be really, really important. Whichever way works for you. If it works better in your refrigerator, that's fine. If not, you can do a little bit faster soak on your countertop, provided it's not too warm. You don't want to leave them on your countertop, for 24 hours. If it's really warm, those beans could begin to actually ferment. You don't want that. But yeah, for 4 to 6 or 8 hours or overnight, that's perfectly fine. That should work. Sammy says, Chef Ken, once I finish my Pro Cook certification, is it possible to share with you some dishes to give me comments and advice? Also, my course, will be ended by mid-February, and I'm 50% so far. Am I on track or behind? So I would say if you're, finishing in mid-February and you're about halfway, you're well on track. That's great. The important thing I think about the pace for people is really knowing that you're going to have certain weeks where you can have more time and more availability and other weeks where you won't. So if you're able to have a regularity with your login and being able to, every few days participate and do the activities, that's perfect. You're well ahead of the game. And absolutely, I'd love to see your work. I do still from time to time get into the queue and do some grading here and there, not nearly as much as I used to. But certainly on top of the commentary and feedback from our amazing chefs, I'd be happy to have a look at your work. That sounds like a lot of fun. Next question here is from Anna. Hi, Chef Ken. I noticed that in a recipe of penne carbonara, one of the ingredients is home smoked tofu. Can you explain how it is you make this, please? So this is a product you can actually make yourself, or you can purchase. So I'm seeing a lot of smoked tofu on the market these days, even at supermarkets. But the way you would do it at home is by setting up just a very, very small impromptu smoker. There's a lot of different ways about going about doing this. I've done them stovetop in a pan that I have designated specially for this. It's a small pan that I can do just small amounts of smoking of nuts or seeds or small amount of vegetables in. I do keep that pan singularly used for that because it does create the intensity of the smoke flavor on the inside of the pan. And I didn't want to wash it and clean it and sterilize it and go through that process every single time. But it's a pretty simple process, where you can get some wood chips and smoke them and basically just put them on a little bit of an elevated rack in a pan, even just for 15 minutes or 20 minutes. That works really, really well. So there's all kinds of techniques around smoking. If you just did a quick Google search, I'm basically applying like a stovetop, what they call a tea smoking technique, where you would also use the same technique to combust tea leaves to create the smoke to add that flavor, versus using a mesquite, or a oak or some other type of a wood chip type product. But one thing I'll caution against: it's very easy to over smoke your food and create a bitterness or an acrid type flavor. So oftentimes less is more for people when it comes to that smokiness. We have had students report back to us that using one of those liquid smoke type products, and there's a number of them out there, in a very, very minimal way, also creates that smoky flavor. So we've had some people essentially make like a smoky style glaze or just a thin coating that becomes a marinade for the tofu to add that smoky flavor without actually having to set up a home smoker. Next question here. This looks like a not plant-based question. Chef Ken, while cooking steak, as many videos in Ruby mentioned, the meat should be dry before cooking. What about if the meat's been marinated by oil and other herbs? Should we remove the marinade before placing it in the pan? Yeah, I would say that when you're going from a state where you're marinating something and there could be oils or herbs or spices or things like that, generally you're going to want to drain that fairly well, let that product essentially drip dry in a sieve, or you can even take like a paper towel and blot it a bit. Doesn't need to be, if it's just oil, it doesn't need to be dry because you're putting it into a pan, and I'm assuming that you want the oil in that pan as a way to help with the cooking process. But really, you don't want all that other excess stuff there. It's not going to help support browning and the dry heat cooking that you're looking for in that context. So certainly probably best to remove that, or to at least diminish the volume of that somewhat before you go into that next cooking mode. Next question. I will be taking the Forks Over Knives course starting today. Will there be a kickoff intro presentation? And number 2, to ensure sufficient time is allocated, especially given holidays, could you provide a rough estimate of what students should anticipate? Yeah, I believe we do have a kickoff presentation. We typically do that within the first week or two of a class starting. And your second question is an important one. I think that when I look at the Forks Over Knives program and I look back at student commentary and feedback, we ask the question of, how much time did you spend in the course? We get some varied answers. We get people saying they spent as few as maybe 2 or 3 hours a week in the course. We get other students who say, gosh, I was spending 7 hours a week in the course. They were cooking every day or shopping, multiple times a week. I would say the best thing to do is really say for yourself, what's a pace that feels comfortable, where it's normal and regular to check in. For some people, the estimate I give is shoot for 20 to 30 tasks a week. That's going to keep you on track. For some people, it's best not to do a daily task average because, number one, a lot of tasks are really short, and it wouldn't be fair to say, oh, great, I did, these tasks and they were only 10 minutes combined versus this one task was 90 minutes of cooking. So I would say just as long as you're getting in that groove of regular work and you're doing that, 20 to 30 tasks a week, you're probably on track. I would say feel pressure or feel caution when you haven't logged in for 4 or 5 days. That's when you want to go back in and definitely get back on track. Is there any commercial loaf bread that is acceptable? Gosh, Karen, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking there. If you're asking about anything particular about whole food plant-based, I would say there's likely some commercial bread that's available that's acceptable. You might want to check out your natural food store and ask the question around what's going to be really a whole grain, and also be inclusive of other nutrient dense foods or even sprouted seeds and things like this. But you might want to just have a look at your local health food store, or if you have a natural section of your supermarket, it might be worth it to check out the stock there. Next question. What are the benefits of eating mushrooms? Do you use okra, ridge gourd, white gourd, rib gourd, fenugreek leaves, moringa leaves, and so on in your recipes? Could you teach how to cook brown rice, millet, teff, amaranth? Whenever I cook, it becomes mushy. Gosh, a few different questions in there. I'll just kind of go through. I'm definitely a big fan of mushrooms. I love cooking mushrooms in a variety of ways. Depending on the mushroom, there are potentially lots of different medicinal or therapeutic different benefits around that. That's something I'm not going to get into. If you have questions specifically about the medical or the wellness benefits, you might check with your healthcare practitioner. But certainly very, very powerful antioxidants used for a variety of different things. So big fan of mushrooms. They're also just delicious and full of flavor, and they extend their flavor to other foods. Low in calorie, high in fiber, high in minerals, so on and so forth. I'm a big fan of okra. I actually just had some stir-fried okra for dinner just a few nights ago with mushrooms, actually. It was quite delicious. I love the texture of okra. The flavor is wonderful. I had an opportunity when I was living in Texas many, many years ago to grow okra. It's a beautiful plant. So yeah, absolutely love it. I do use fenugreek leaves. I use moringa leaves oftentimes in cooking. Although, I'm cooking for my family, so I try to keep things, fairly basic for my kids in particular. They're adventurous, but sometimes they just want something, completely recognizable for them. They do eat a variety of the grains, including some of the grains that you reference here. I would say if they're coming out mushy, you're just simply cooking with too much liquid. So when it comes to things like millet and teff, because of their size and their shape, being very, very, very small, kind of granular, they have a tendency to become pasty or mushy or soft with being overcooked with too much liquid. Things like brown rice, very easy to moderate the volume of liquid there. I'll typically soak my brown rice and then apply a pretty standard ratio of about 1-to-1. So after my soaking, just about 1 cup of the soaked rice to or the rice that then becomes soaked to 1 cup of water. Maybe a tiny bit more depending on the vessel that I'm cooking in, but it's really just a ratio game. So about 1-to-1, slightly more if you want your rice to be just a little bit more wet. But for rice salads and things like this, I prefer to be on the drier side because then I can rehydrate it with a vinaigrette or some flavorful liquid or some other thing like that. So yeah, check your moisture levels. Next question, what knives do you recommend? Which brand, which ones, how many are essential? Do you recommend a set of knives? Which knives are essential? I would say, starting with just a really good chef knife, something in that 7, 8, 9-inch range. It could be, more along the lines of that European style knife that has a thicker spine and a heavier bolster, a little bit more weight, or more Japanese or Asian style knife that has a thinner profile, usually a little bit different bolster or not even a full bolster, but also just a much lighter knife. So it's, something I would say that's going to be a personal choice. You don't need to go and spend a ton of money on a knife. You can buy really quality knife these days from a big box store or online. I would recommend that, one good suggestion before you buy is to, if you can, I know I just mentioned online, but if you can, holding the knife is good before you buy it. It's one of those things where the way it feels in your hand, the balance, the weight, all those things become important. It's a very personal thing. So just because a knife is highly rated doesn't mean it's going to fit in your hand well. The other thing around the knife is just maintenance. A decent knife that's maintained really well is much better than an awesome knife that's left in your knife drawer to become dull and everything else. So maintaining that knife is going to be key. So buying one that you feel comfortable sharpening and honing is going to also be an important piece. Nancy says, thank you, Chef Ken. I'm concerned about meeting protein requirements. As an older active person, should I be getting about 30 grams of protein with each meal? I'm not sure that the recipes I see meet these needs. What do you suggest? Nancy, I would maybe suggest talking to your healthcare provider about, your nutrition and your protein needs. Most people, I think, have an unwarranted idea of how much protein they think they need. A lot of that is, I think, promoted by media and everything else. I think when you look at most people on plant-based diets, they're very well exceeding the recommended amounts of protein intake that are set by the World Health Organization and the National Institutes for Health and all those other groups that are kind of creating those recommendations. Most healthy active adults, probably need somewhere in that 60 to 90 grams a day, and they can get that, throughout their day, not just during the main meals. They can get that from a wide variety of food combinations, not just by having foods that, read the macronutrients as having like a lot of protein always, but you can piece those things together. Lots of vegetables have protein, but they're in smaller amounts. But if you're eating them again in their constituent parts and building a salad or building a meal out of those, you're going to be in good shape. So I would just say, as long as you're eating a wide variety of those plant-based foods, you're getting nuts and seeds and legumes and beans, whole grains, green leafy vegetables, chances are better than not that you're doing really, really well. But again, check with your healthcare practitioner about your particular needs. For myself, I haven't really had concerns about protein intake. I'm more concerned about like feeling satisfied and feeling full and having enough, to kind of feel like I've been satiated. And I get that through a combination primarily of nuts and seeds and legumes and beans. Nancy B, this is a response from Hannah. Just sharing a little bit. So she says human protein needs are about 5 to 15% of total calories, or 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram of lean body mass. Whole food plant-based diets with beans, starches, dark leafy greens easily provide ample protein. Yeah. So just reiterating what I said, I'll also just say that all those large health organizations that I referenced earlier all acknowledge plant-based diets as being completely sufficient for all stages of one's life cycle. So also no issues for children or for women who are pregnant or lactating. Next question here. What is the difference between veggie stock versus broth? What is the best way to make one's own? Yeah, I would just say this is a question we get a lot. It's so confusing. These are terms that get thrown around. The word stock and broth, and when you apply it to vegetables, what does it mean? And I would say in the case of vegetables, they're really interchangeable. What we're talking about is a flavorful liquid made from submerging vegetables in hot water, hot flavorful liquid for some period of time, and you're extracting those flavors and those colors from those products. So whether you call it a broth or a stock, just know it's going to be flavorful liquid with a certain flavor profile. It could be a mushroom stock or a mushroom broth. It could be more of a classic vegetable using mirepoix, like a celery, onion, carrot type flavor mix. It could be one that leans more one direction than the other by including leeks or by including some other aromatic type vegetables. So really it just kind of all depends on what you want to do in terms of the flavor. I make lots of different kinds of vegetable stocks or broths. One that I really love is kind of an unusual one that's made from tomatoes and some sun-dried tomatoes, as well as remnant corn cobs from, I'll grill corn or make corn on the cob, and then I'll save those cobs and simmer them with some bay leaves and onions and garlic and make just a really kind of sweet corn flavored broth or stock. So really sky's the limit, I'll say, when it comes to infusing more flavor into the foods that you're cooking. That's one of the secret weapons of really delicious food, is having those base flavors come through by using those those flavorful vegetable broths and stocks. Yeah, no real difference. I think a lot of it just comes down to what term you're more comfortable with. In the non-plant-based world, they have very definitive differences, but it's based on bones versus meat and bones and all these other things that just don't apply in the plant-based space. So hopefully that helps you. Are there any recommendations for cookware, bakeware brands and retailers? And do they offer student discounts? I don't really have any strong recommendations. I think that you can buy great cookware nearly anywhere. It doesn't need to be fancy or expensive. You don't need to buy premium level cookware or bakeware. I have brands that I know and I trust and I love, and they tend to be a little bit more on the higher end side because I buy cookware that I intend to maybe pass down to my kids and things that I'm going to put through a lot of stress. But for most people, I would say that most of the brands that you see are going to be perfectly acceptable. If you do subscribe to the idea that some of these pots and pans are going to be things that you want to keep around, then paying a little bit more is going to have a more durable product. If it's heavier, it's going to have better heat retention. You get better results when you do things like have better heat retention. So those are some options. I do know that many retailers have student discounts. So if any students want to share what those retailers might be, that's also perfectly fine. I'm not sure which ones offhand have student discounts. Next question: what places do you visit for inspiration or recipes, websites, books, etc.? Oh gosh, so many places. I would say that food media more generally can be a place of great inspiration, also a place of great confusion. So I would say that for me, it's a combination of things. I go back to a lot of the cookbooks behind me, things that were published 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago, and I oftentimes find great inspiration in those books. In many cases, what's old becomes new again, and what someone thought of to solve a certain problem or address a certain issue in the past becomes repurposed and reused in some unique way. But yeah, I don't know of anything really offhand in terms of particular place I go to, but I would just say constantly reading. A lot of my inspiration is drawn through food stories, people who have experiences around food that are unique, and really kind of uncovering or unpacking what they're cooking and why, and not so much trying to replicate that food, but really understanding and drawing inspiration from how a certain scenario or a certain context or a certain story created the space to create certain types of food. That to me is really, really interesting. Certainly with COVID and people being at home and people being forced to cook in a way has been very interesting for me to watch people's level of interest and people's kind of, in some cases, food fatigue, really just sort of go through some of its own life cycles around just this new relationship that many of us have with cooking. So pretty interesting. Hi, do you have some vegan Thanksgiving recipes? Well, yeah, I would say for me, some of the hits that I've done in the past for plant-based sides are really just some variations on the favorites. So all the different dressings or stuffings that you can make that are very, very easy to make plant-based. They're basically just plants to start with anyway. Roasted root vegetables, sky's the limit. Thinking about, for me, I love the turnips, the parsnips, the rutabaga. They have so much natural sweetness. They have some really interesting counter notes of bitterness and great texture. So I love to pair those with a lot of fresh herbs, some citrus, just really, really delicious things. I'll take, some of these family favorites or classic type dishes and just, apply a plant-based approach to it. So creamed greens is something that my family loves, and just so easy to do it with spinach and cashew cream versus a dairy product or using sour cream or a bechamel type base. But yeah, using cashew cream or a cashew bechamel is awesome. It's super easy. No one even knows. No one even cares. It's completely rich and satisfying. Allows people to eat those greens with abandon. But yeah, I would say that Thanksgiving is one of those holidays that I think is kind of built for plant-based sides. So many of them are already delicious and plant-based. Next question. I have a question about food safety. I love food safety questions. When you cook something that's good for 5 to 7 days in the refrigerator, if you cook something and then freeze it a couple of days later, when you defrost it, is it still 5 to 7 days from the cook time or the defrost date to eat? So I would say it's tricky. So there's a few things to weigh here. One is just pure safety, and the other is the palatability or the texture or the quality of the product. And some things just I don't freeze because they don't thaw well, they don't do well. So putting that aside, from a pure safety point of view, if you cook something and you have it in your fridge and it's been otherwise perfectly treated, you keep it in your fridge for 5 days, and then you decide to freeze it. Upon thawing, you should really eat that food really in that next 2 days, just to keep into that 5 to 7 day window. Freezing doesn't kill pathogens most of the time. It does in a few small examples, but the majority of the time, freezing doesn't kill pathogens. It might put them into a spore-like state or an inactive state, in which case, when they become warm again or when things become hospitable again, they just start to multiply and grow again. So something that was potentially harboring a foodborne illness on day 5 can be frozen, thawed, improperly reheated, and then totally conceivably pass along a foodborne illness to you. So I would say, err on the side of caution. If your intent is to make something and freeze it, just freeze it early on in the process. You'll have better results, and you'll be able to recoup all that extra time on the other side. Certain things I would say might be fine even past there. It just depends on how wet, how acidic, how much of a reheating you can do. There's a lot of different things that I think play into a food safety or safe food handling other than just the age. Certainly something that's ready to eat, not going to be reheated, will be a lot riskier than something that you can, steam for a few minutes and have it be perfectly fine. Next question here. What is the difference of sprouted wheat in bread such as Ezekiel bread or regular? I have a sensitivity to gluten. So Shauna, if you have a gluten sensitivity, you shouldn't have any wheat, sprouted or not. The sprouted wheat simply refers to wheat that was, quite literally sprouted before being used in that bread. And there's a lot of things that happen with the texture and the flavor and the nutrition of the sprouted wheat versus just conventional wheat that's ground and turned into flour the way most bread is. So the sprouted wheat has, that added element that makes it just a little bit different, but there's nothing about it that removes the gluten or makes it otherwise suitable for a person who's sensitive to gluten. Catherine says, hi, can I have a soy allergy? Is there any other bean other than soybean I can use to mimic tofu? Good question. I would say that tofu has this ability, especially when used like in a sauce or in a cold custard, to be very creamy and to have this extending type creamy quality to it. And it definitely also has a mouthfeel that resembles dairy. It doesn't have a grittiness or a graininess. When you blend silken tofu, like I did a few days ago, I blended silken tofu with some melted dark chocolate and then swirled in some peanut butter to make like a peanut butter tofu chocolate mousse. No one knows it's tofu. I have to say, hey, this is a tofu chocolate mousse for people to know. Otherwise, they just think it's creamy, delicious, mousse-like dessert. That texture is hard to replicate. Tofu is also unique because of the protein, volume in there, and that is also playing into the functionality, all that protein. So when I think about, what are those beans that can help mimic or replicate that? There's nothing really that jumps to mind. I would say if you're using it for creaminess, you might just go straight to a nut or a seed, so like a cashew cream or something, if that's your goal. It's not going to set up the same way, not going to work quite the same way. If you're looking just for kind of that fortifying feeling, like adding tofu to something just to help give it more body, like it's a filling for a pasta or something like that, you might find that depending on the flavor profile, you're going for something like a neutral white bean, a pureed and then recooked mashed navy bean or a white bean might add some of that body or that texture. Certainly when that gets cooked and recombined with food, it's going to add a lot of thickening power and texture to that food. But otherwise, tofu kind of stands in a category being special because it's unique. It does certain things functionally that just a lot of other beans or bean products don't do it as well. Next question here. Hi, Chef Ken. I have a large vegetable garden. It is coming to an end of the growing season. I have a lot of zucchini, yellow squash, green and red bell pepper. How would be the best way to freeze these vegetables so they don't become mushy when thawed out? Oh gosh, it's I'm going through a similar thing right now. It sounds like I don't have quite as much as you do, but I'm certainly dealing with some end of the season zucchini and squash. I have a lot of tomatillos right now. A lot of green tomatoes that aren't going to make it, and a lot of little tiny eggplants I'm trying to figure out what to do with right now. I would say, one thing to do, and it just always depends on the volume of how much you have, and also depends on really what you can process and freeze and store. But some of these things that if you're worried about the texture becoming mushy or soft upon thawing, I would preemptively roast them. And you can take zucchini chunks and roast them at a really nice high temperature, a nice hot oven, and just build color, build some color, some texture, some flavor on that product. And that way, because when you thaw it, it's going to be soft. That way that you can then puree that squash and use it as a soup base, or you could toss it with some lettuces or some whatever it is, cooked pasta in a pasta salad, and you can find some great utility. But by pre-roasting it, you're giving it a chance to develop some flavor. You're also developing some texture, and upon second life, rethawing, you might just have better options than if you just took it and cut it and put it in the freezer, and then when you pulled it out, decided to do something with it. So the freezing after you process it approach might be best there. When it comes to something like peppers, I would say, make a relish, make a chutney, make something that you might be able to put up that has some acidifying component, whether it's, lacto-fermented, kind of a proper fermented pickled peppers, let's call them, or something where you did a quicker style pickle using vinegar, added vinegar to create that acid. Both would work. Next question. Hi, Chef Ken. Can we prepare hollandaise in a different way from the video in Ruby? I mean, by blender or a whisking machine for fast operation, or should we do it manual, having low heat below the sauce while whisking it? So, great question. The way we teach it is designed to help the student understand the practical underpinnings behind the technique. It's certainly not the only way to make hollandaise. There are many, many ways to perform lots of different culinary functions. But our videos are designed from a method or from a technique approach to give the hows and the whys, the reasons behind why you wouldn't want too much heat, right? Too much heat is going to cause that sauce to separate or break, create the pooling effect with the fat. If you're, not whisking it well and you're just stirring it, you might not get the emulsification or the aeration and have that visual or texture appeal. So there's a variety of different things I think to consider when you're preparing it, but certainly by no means is the way we show it the only way to do it. But we are deliberate in why we show it that way, I should say. It's definitely designed to show you the steps along the way so that you can, for your own self, do those shortcuts, right? Next question. Thanks in advance for your answer, Ken. What's the best way to clean a wood cutting board? I know if you use water, bacteria has a tendency to settle in it. So, I would say that the best thing to do for a wooden cutting board, and this is how I've treated my wooden cutting boards, is the best thing to do, number one is, upon, completion of your cooking task, take that cutting board, just wipe it down, with a dry towel. Make sure there's no particulate matter. I'll oftentimes carry it to the sink with just a very, very damp cloth with some soapy water. Give it a quick wash down, a good rinse, and then I'll put it on its side to dry. It's really important to air dry sideways, kind of lengthwise, so that water doesn't pool on the surface and the water's, sloughing off down and evaporating versus sitting on the surface and pooling in. So I'm washing it and then I'm letting it dry. The issue around wood is that over time you could have some warping, or the wood begins to degrade. You get some larger opportunities for bacteria and everything else to kind of settle in. Just make sure that you have a cutting board that's really well maintained, right? No holes or pock marks or big gouges or big holes in it. You don't want to have any way to have food kind of stick in there and hang around, let's say. But certainly you want to make sure that with a wood cutting board you're being just cautious of the handling of that a little bit more. Next question from Dior. What is your go-to plant-based dish? I don't have a single dish. I would say if I were to maybe categorize which of those foods in the plant-based space I go to a lot, I would say lentils is probably one of the big ones. I do a lot with lentils. It's one of my very favorite foods. It's probably what I have for lunch 5 out of 7 days a week, and the days I don't have it for lunch, I probably have it for dinner. All different kinds of lentils: red lentils, green, black lentils. I love the texture. I love the flavor. Great, inexpensive protein source. They carry flavor. They have their own flavor. So I do a lot with lentils, and oftentimes initially cooked in a fairly plain manner, but then dressed up with some richly flavored sauce, a chimichurri, a salsa, a curry, a series of sauces that might match together. And then, lots of other things that I can stir in or put on top, whether it's roasted vegetables or steamed vegetables, or what I oftentimes do is just flash cook some mustard greens or collard greens, and those either go in with the lentils or on the side of the lentils. And that's kind of how I eat. I don't cook fancy meals for myself very often. I love to still do that, but most of my meals are just based on the utility of having to prepare something quickly and have something that I like the flavor of and get some great nutrition, some texture. Next question here from Karen. I'm finding items such as special flours to come in small quantities at big prices from local grocers. Any recommendations on reliable sources for bulk purchases at reasonable prices for specialty flours, spices, etc.? So question from Karen, really asking about the economy of some of these things. I know that sometimes healthy eating or scratch cooking gets a bad rap because of people saying it costs a lot. And I think certainly that can be true. One thing that I think the COVID has done, it's forced us all to rethink, the value of our food and where our food comes from. Certain things just weren't available even at certain periods of time during the last few months. To answer your question, I think when it comes to reliable bulk purchases, there's a few places that I go. One is Bob's Red Mill, and I know Bob's Red Mill in part because their national headquarters are just down the street from where I live here in Oregon. I've been using their products for as long as I can remember, probably since the late 80s. And I just have a lot of confidence in their products. I find them to be reasonably priced, high quality. There's a huge range of products available from them. So, if you can order from them, whether online or, seek them out at your grocer, they're going to be a a good option for many people. Otherwise, I would really look online and see, what your best bets are. Many times, even in a local supermarket or a local natural food store, if you tell them, "Hey, do you offer a 10-pound bag of this, or can I get a case of this?" They're more than happy to special order it, oftentimes at a discount to you for getting that case. So just maybe ask the question, but otherwise, my first go-to in terms of a brand that I know is going to have just a wide range of products for people is probably that Bob's Red Mill. Cooking and food is all about taste. How are you going to evaluate it? The balance of seasoning, texture, doneness. Thanks. So great question. Cooking is really, for the user about that experience of eating, and taste is a big part of that, without doubt. But teaching cooking is really about the process and the steps. And it's taken us many years, but we found in designing our courses and designing our assessments that we're able to position students in a certain way, to walk them through an activity, a series of steps, a process, where through the demonstration of activity, they're able to show us just a tremendous amount of knowledge and competency on a certain topic. So if a student prepares something and I can see their mise en place, I can see what their knife cuts look like, I can see what their ingredient selection, I can see their proportion of the ingredients. When I see the cooking technique or techniques, I can see the degree of coloration, the degree of browning, the degree of starch being created in a dish, or whatever it is that we're looking for in that process. And of course, with a final plated dish, with some reflection, some information back from you, what you've shared, what you've learned, I can learn a lot about the shortcomings of a dish. If you describe it as too salty or too sweet or too sour, it's actually, for me, more useful in that self-assessment that you're able to identify it. But certainly along the way, we can help you with the technique parts and those key outcomes. We can't taste it. We can't say more salt next time. But those are really, really easy things to fix when it comes to cooking. If you don't know how to saute or dry saute or steam or roast or emulsify or poach, or how to do a basic knife cut, those are all things that we can identify very easily visually and support you on. Next question here from Hannah. I am making Chad's brisket, which is actually made from seitan. The graded assignment for my husband's birthday party on Thursday. I'm also working most of that day. I like to complete the dish the day before to be able to finish reheat on a hot grill and plate, if that will work. Yeah, it should work. I just really urge you to just work on your timing. If you were to make that brisket and kind of essentially pre-cook it beforehand, that would be fine. You could then find a way to gently reheat that, and then if you want to finish on a grill to create that smoke and that final finish, that's also great. The key, I think, to that dish, in part, is having enough of the flavor and the acidity of the sauce coming through, not to slice it too thickly, to really make the slices of brisket nice and thin, and that way it mimics the chew, and people aren't chewing too much, and they're finding all that flavor to be really easy to get through in their mouth, that sensory experience. But that should work out great. One of the things I'll say is, taste it before you put it on the grill. And that way you can readjust your seasoning either with some more acid or some more sweetness or any of those last minute things. Don't wait until you plate it to give it that taste. That's going to be too late to fix anything at that point. And then to the follow-up question, I'm assuming that the seitan will chill and reheat without degradation, be held in its braising sauce for a day or more. Not certain about that. So yeah, I would say, cook it in advance. Leave it with some sauce, but I wouldn't leave it submerged in the sauce. You don't want it to become too logged or waterlogged with that sauce, but certainly you want to keep that sauce, because if you need to slather that on after reheating and slicing, that's going to be really, really key. Next question here, will we be able to ask questions here after we graduate? Yes, so our office hours are typically available for everyone. You can come back to Ruby and join us. It's a great way to stay engaged. Hi, Chef Ken. I'm aware that all submitted photos should be very clear, but will it count against my grade if I submit the photos of my diced ingredients on my black cutting board for task 36? Sharon, I'm going to leave that to the chef instructors to determine. It really is best to present them on a light colored or neutral colored cutting board. If it's, a dark or a black board, you might not be able to see it very well or have the contrast as much as we want. But I'll leave it to the chefs. If it's a grade that you're not happy with, you can always use the Ruby Supreme Court on that one. Next question, similar to roasting pans, best for no oil saute? Yeah, I would say for a no oil saute, excuse me, the best bet for roasting pan is just going to be a regular half sheet pan with parchment paper. I would say for myself, that's probably 90% of how I do no oil roasting, is just in that pan. When it comes to saute, I'm using a 10 or 12 inch stainless steel pan. That to me is going to provide the very best platform for the no oil saute. Some people prefer to use enamel cast iron or some other types of surfaces. For me, it's just about the stainless steel. Next question, what knives do you recommend? Which brands? How many do you find essential? What do you think of Damascus Steel? And how do you feel about hex-clad pans? Thank you. Yeah, I don't really have any knives to recommend. I use many different brands of knives, just like I use many different brands of pans. I really like the knives that I use because of how they fit in my hand, because of how I can maintain them easily. The reality is even though I own, I don't know how many knives, maybe 80 knives or 100 knives or something ridiculous, I use like 3 of them or 4 of them, 90% of the time, 95% of the time. So you don't need a lot of knives to cook. You don't need special knives. I would say just 1 or 2 good knives, a good chef knife, a good paring knife, a serrated knife for bread and soft vegetables like tomatoes is great, but you can do most of what you need to do with 1 knife. And then your secondary set can be as small as, like I said, adding a paring knife and a serrated knife. Should be good to go. Damascus Steel is great, tends to be more expensive, sometimes requires some more care in terms of that blade. They're certainly beautiful. There's no correlation between Damascus being sharper or better in any other way. It just has a really beautiful visual appeal. And hex-clad pans, I've never used one, so I don't really have an opinion. I've seen them on the market, but I've never used one myself, so I don't really have an opinion in terms of performance or anything like that. Next question here, recipes call for your favorite herbs, and I don't have a clue as to what to use. Is there some way to figure that one out? If it's not salt or pepper, I just don't know what to do right now. In the course, it says that for your zucchini, you just cooked. So, Francine, only you can answer that question. It's your mouth, your taste buds. My recommendation is to go to the store and buy some of those herbs. So I would buy some parsley, some basil, some cilantro, some chives, and I'd make that zucchini, and I would take a little bit of each one of those herbs and taste it. And your mouth will tell you which one you like, which one you want to have another bite of. And your mouth will also tell you gosh, I didn't like that. That was too strong. That was too assertive, or I like it, but I use too much. That's fair also. But, that's going to be a sensory response that you have. You might decide that, you only like one of them. And then you might decide that you like one of them, but you like it cooked, not raw. So it's really going to be, I would say, up to you. Put yourself in the driver's seat here. Go ahead and buy those products so you can begin to experiment with them. And then, once you determine for yourself what you like, this is really about, gosh, I'm not even sure what I like. What do I like? Then it gives you a lot of information so that next time you're searching out a recipe or you're deciding what to make for dinner and you see something that has the flavor that you like, it's like, great, that's a good starting point, right? If you you hate cilantro, then don't seek out recipes that use cilantro or that depend on cilantro. And if you see cilantro, you can always know that, well, gosh, most of the time I can just substitute parsley or chives or something else for that. And sure, it'll change the flavor of the dish, but it's not going to make it inedible. It's not going to make it bad. It's just going to make it a little bit different. So, I invite you to go into that exercise with curiosity and with joy, and with knowing that at the end of the process, you're going to have some really good information. You're going to know what you like. And that's really important. A lot of people go through life thinking they're expected to like certain kinds of foods because they're popular or because other people like them. And that's just sometimes not the case. Again, we all have different taste buds. Our mouths all perceive foods differently. So it's super important that you figure out, what it is you like to eat. It's going to make this whole cooking thing a lot more fun. Have any of the plant-based Ruby chefs acquired a specialty cuisine? And if so, which one? Gosh, it's a question I'd love to ask some of our chefs on faculty. I know that, all of our chefs approach food and cooking from a very kind of broad brush approach, meaning that, they enjoy and appreciate food from a variety of different angles, different contexts. I don't know that anyone on the team in particular has a thing that they might call out as a specialty within plant-based. I do know that each of us has certain types of foods and flavors that we go to, and certain foods that we, for ourselves, think about as being comfort foods and things like this. So I think that's all super interesting to see. Yeah, what are those foods that we gravitate towards? For me, it's a lot of foods from Latin America, from Mexico. Those are the flavors that I probably go to the most. And, secondarily, probably for me, the Middle East. And then, from there, probably to the Mediterranean and to Europe, and then into Asia. For other people, probably starting in Southeast Asia, or starting in some other regional tradition. So it's a great question. I think it's one that, when you're in your course, you might even ask your faculty members, ask your chef instructor what they might say, and I'd be really, really curious. Next question here: what can be substituted for celeriac, celery root, in the fresh vegetable bouillon? It's going to provide a pretty unique flavor, celery-like, but also with some of the depth and the sweetness that the root can help to bring. I wouldn't worry about replacing it. I would just say, if you're making a veggie stock or a veggie broth and you don't have that, just find some other way to build additional flavor. I might use some parsnips, or just a very, very small amount of some fennel fronds or some other things, just to add a little extra dimension, kind of that extra little bit of character, not to overpower or to create kind of an overweight feeling broth, something that just feels heavy in your mouth, but something that just feels more dynamic and more interesting, where your palate is like a little bit intrigued, a little bit interested in what's next, in that next bite, that next drink. Next question from Brent. When making nut-based cheeses, soak overnight, or can you provide a minimum amount of time to soak? Yeah, gosh, it really, I think, depends on the type of nut or seed that you're soaking. I do a lot of work with broken cashews just because I can buy raw, broken organic cashews for like half the cost of whole cashews, and they soak a lot faster than whole cashews. So I also don't have to go through that whole overnight soak or longer soak. I find that with those broken up pieces, an hour or two is perfectly fine. So I wouldn't feel compelled to soak overnight. If you feel like it gives you a better hydration, a better final product in terms of texture, then by all means, you should do that. I find that when I soak some of the larger nuts like macadamia, certainly like a Brazil nut, those are just bigger, so they take more time. But so much of what I do is working with cashew pieces, which, like I said before, very, very quick to soak. Next question. Thank you, Chef Rubin. What can I use in place of olive oil in my tabbouleh? Yeah, so to add just that richness of flavor, one of the things I do that I keep on hand are, I referenced earlier some of these different stocks or broths that I make. I referenced a corn cob style broth that I like. There's also a broth that I like to make that's pretty, I would say, tomato and herb heavy. It's got onion, shallot, garlic, remnants of raw tomatoes, some tomato paste that I'll actually toast in the bottom of the pan, and then some kind of random sun-dried tomatoes and things that I'll use just to kind of add some more umami, some more savory flavor. So I would take something like that, like my tomato broth, and just add, maybe a reduced amount of that down to a half a cup or a quarter cup, and add that in. That's going to add just a huge flavor punch. It's going to lighten up the texture a little bit, add some moisture, some of that kind of feeling where it's not so dry or so individual feeling. Tabbouleh also loves, I think more than anything, just tons of acid and fresh herbs. So to that, I could add a lot of lemon zest, some lemon juice. I would add just big handful of fresh chopped parsley, maybe a small amount of mint, some cilantro works really well in there. The tops of green onions, just scallion greens, beautiful in that tabbouleh. Wouldn't worry so much about the absence of the olive oil flavor as much as I'd worry about not including lots of other great, big, bold, interesting flavors to enhance the dish, right? So a little bit of a different approach, I guess. Next question, are there any smaller toaster ovens that you recommend? Again, on the same theme, I don't really have any that I recommend specifically. I know that Breville and Cuisinart and lots of other, well-known brands make kind of smaller size toaster ovens. I'm a big fan of using them, especially in cases when you don't have to heat up your entire house, just to do something small that's involving roasting. So a lot of times these toaster ovens, they're really more just like ovens that also toast versus being a toaster. That's the way I think about them. They're convection ovens. They have the capacity to work at a really high temperature and even have a convection fan to facilitate browning and crisping and development of texture on those fronts. Next question. Hi, Chef. How do you make sorghum rotis? Gosh, that would be a little bit more involved than what we have time for today. But I would say that sorghum flour itself makes an excellent flavorful flour as a gluten-free alternative. It's one of my go-to flours for a gluten-free alternative. I do make, I would say, more like a sorghum pancake or more like a crepe. It's not really like a roti bread. that has sorghum plus garbanzo, a small amount of glutinous rice flour, and a small amount of whole wheat flour. So it's not a gluten-free product, but just has an amazing texture, an amazing flavor, and just, kind of the ability to be pliable. That was one of the things I was looking for in particular when I was working on that sorghum crepe. Next question here from Vicky. I'm taking the Forks Over Knives course. If I don't have a certain ingredient, can I substitute it for something else as long as I show the desired result you're looking for? 100%. Don't worry. Don't get caught up on the ingredient. If you don't have chives and you use parsley instead, or you don't have coriander seed and use cumin instead, like, that's fine. We want to make sure you understand the core competency, the core technique. Any modification or adaptation you make to a recipe, as far as I'm concerned, is great. You're showing critical thinking skills, your ability to problem solve in very real time, right? It could be a substitution based on the fact that someone has an allergy. It could be based on just that you don't want to go to the store and get that product and you have something that already fits. Or maybe a preference. If someone in your family doesn't like it, they don't want to eat it, so you're not going to cook it just to have it be refused. So all those are very, very understandable. When cooking plant-based whole food recipes, what are the best pans to use? I always go back to kind of my standard pans, which are going to be stainless steel pans, unlined stainless steel pans. So whether it's All Clad or some other similar brand, I just like mid to heavyweight stainless steel pans. I find that they provide really good performance. I don't have to worry about a surface chipping or scratching or anything like that. They're non-reactive to foods that might be acidic, like working with tomatoes or sometimes different fruit juices or vinegars. So those are some of the considerations I make. I would say, those non-reactive pans that are not too light, like a stainless steel pan. Next question, for pastry class, what are necessary purchases? So many things on the equipment list. So Susie, I would say, if you have a particular question, I'm not really able to answer your particular need here. I want to look at kind of what you have and what you don't have, and to see which of those things you might be able to repurpose. But if you were to give our student services team a buzz or send them an email, they'd be able to more directly help you out with looking at that list and saying, yeah, here's the things you only use in 2 or 3 tasks versus here are the things you need to use all the time. And if that changes, the way you use the class, or if you want to go borrow one of those pieces of equipment from a neighbor or something like that, that might be a good decision. Next question here. I am ready to sign up for the certification program and leaning toward the plant-based. Am I able to access classes on meat cooking as well to supplement my course? So Cami, again, I'd recommend that you just give our student services team a call. If you want to take the plant-based certification program, but otherwise have access to other Ruby courses that include animal products, I'd probably recommend that you sign up for the Plant-Based Professional and then just become a member of Ruby's general membership site, which will give you access to our recipe database that includes non-plant-based options. So that might be your best way in. Next question here. We're making a fruit paste. The recipe says, if adding the vanilla bean, remove the seeds from the bean and add it to the blender as well. Not having used vanilla beans before, can you tell me if I'm adding the seeds or I'm adding the pod? It's not clear. So great question. You want to be really careful when you're handling the vanilla bean pod in terms of how to scrape it and get the vanilla bean paste and all those little seeds out of there. that's really what you're going for when we're asking you to add the vanilla bean seeds and paste. Typically what you do if you're starting with a pod, and you can also just use store-bought vanilla extract or a vanilla paste if you're trying to add that flavor. But if you're starting with a vanilla bean, which is great, you're going to take a small paring knife. You're going to cut that vanilla bean lengthwise, not all the way through, but just kind of partially cut it through, a little bit like a science experiment, and just cut through that first layer of the pod, and then with the back of your knife, scrape the length of that vanilla bean pod and get all that pulp, which is really just the seeds, little tiny black specks. Get all that pulp and all those seeds out of that vanilla bean pod. So that's the easiest way to do it. You're essentially extracting the innards of that pod and using that paste or those seeds as your primary flavoring agent. You'll notice that the exterior of the pod, kind of that skin or the shell outside that long pod, is going to be very fibrous, very tough, still have some flavor contained within it, but not something that you want to eat or chew on or include in a recipe, right? It's not something you want to serve to a guest and have them come out and say, hey, I can't get through this vanilla bean pod here. It's pretty tough, So it's the inside of that pod that you really want to extract. Now, what I do with my pods that I've scraped is I still save those. I'll save those and I'll add them to something that I'm making that might be a sweet pickle or a relish, or if I'm making jam or jelly and I'm simmering some peaches, let's say, I'll just put that kind of spent vanilla bean pod in there. It's going to still give some flavor, not as much as if it were whole, but I'm still extracting some flavor from that pod in an effort not to waste anything. So that's going to be your best bet, just kind of following that process. Next question. Hi, Chef Ken. What changes do I need to make to my diet to increase B12 vitamins to the vegetarian diet? What foods do I need to add? So B12 is one of those things that is really available in food sources, primarily through non-plant-based foods. So people talk about meat and dairy and things being your primary B12 sources. It's why a lot of people who are completely on a plant-based diet or a vegan diet take B12 as a supplement. It's one of the supplements I take, one of the very, very few supplements that I take. A lot of people who eat animal products are also B12 deficient. So it's not something that's just endemic amongst plant-based people by any stretch. But when it comes to plant-based foods high in B12, there's just not that many. Certain seaweeds are high in B12. There's a handful of other things that have some trace B12, but otherwise it's something that a lot of people will just get with the supplement. Renee says, thank you, Chef. Lots of great information. Very useful. Well, thank you for joining us. Always great to see our students joining these sessions. Next question here from Catherine. I'm very interested in using spices. I just made a soup that had kale and cinnamon. Would have never put that together. What other combinations do you like? Particularly any unusual surprises? One book I'll recommend, Catherine, is a book called The Flavor Bible. Karen Page and Andrew Dornenberg, who wrote that book, also have a book called The Plant-Based Flavor Bible. So it's a vegetarian version of the Flavor Bible. It's just a really, really awesome book. If you're looking at combinations of foods, flavors that you want to put together, things that you might pair, those books are really, really good. There's lots of other books about flavor and flavor pairings. There's even websites dedicated to this idea. And some of it's very personal, and some of it has some strong science behind it, where you can find some combinations of foods that people, across the board, across ages, across cultures, might, more generally find as being satisfying or pleasing. So it's pretty interesting. I would say, experimenting. We had an earlier question about using fresh herbs, and what do I do with that? Is, let your palate make the decision. You'll know very quickly when you put something in your mouth. Is that pleasing? Was it interesting but not pleasing? Was it something that I want to do again? Is it something that I would, in the case of like making a meal, is it something that I would love and come back to this restaurant? Is it something that I would tell the waiter or waitress, hey, I think there's something wrong with my food here. It seems overspiced or underspiced, or like the flavors don't go together. So that's all the fun. That's all the good stuff when it comes to learning how to cook. Next question here. I've completed the 90-day plant-based class, and I'm almost done with the dessert class. I'm wondering what you may suggest next. I saw the health, I'm not sure, health grew class, and it looks like a lot of the same content suggestions for more learning. Patricia, I might ask that you call our customer support team. Just anyone on that team, John or Dee or Shoshana or Keegan, can walk you through maybe some other options. If you've done the 90-day program, it could be that the longer 6-month plant-based professional program might be good for you. Maybe the vegan desserts course is good for you. So yeah, just not sure. Just really depends on what your goals are and kind of what your world looks like right now. Linda says, thank you, Ken. What is the best way to cook jackfruit? Gosh, Linda, I had jackfruit cooked a lot of different ways. I find it works really well for me with other ingredients that complement the flavor absorbing qualities and the texture of it. I've had really good luck using it as fillings for enchiladas and tacos and other things like that, where I can add, lots of chopped onion, texture of, finely shaved cabbage, shaved radish, other things like that. To me, the jackfruit itself does really well absorbing flavors. I love putting kind of bolder, spicier flavors with it. I'll do the jackfruit again, like as an enchilada or as a filling for tamales, where I'll have the jackfruit with pretty aggressive use of acid, so some vinegar and chilies, so like chipotle chili or something with that smokiness that adds just another layer of dimensionality to the dish. I find the smoke helps for a lot of people who want that savoriness and that richness, as if it were meat but don't want to have meat. So the jackfruit works, just works wonders in that kind of scenario. Next question, is there a substitute for beer in a recipe? Yeah, I would just say, in many cases, maybe not a great substitute, but using some stock or some broth just to add some flavor is going to be good. Beer can have a maltiness or a little bit of a sweetness or a nuttiness or toastiness as a flavor as well. So part of it just depends on the recipe. If it's something that you're not interested in using, but has a very particular flavor, there's non-alcoholic type beers and beverages out there that might mimic or replicate some of that toasty, nutty, malty type flavor. Next question, is there a commercial bread we can eat? Again, I saw a similar question earlier. I'm not sure what particular dietary requirements you have, but certainly there are a lot of commercial bread products available for people who have dietary restrictions or who want to maintain a whole food plant-based diet. You might look in the freezer section versus in the fresh bakery section, because a lot of those products might be housed there. Next question here from Shauna. Chef Ken, I just started the Forks Over Knives course, and I'm on the pantry and fridge reset. Is there a time limit to send in the reset photo, especially since my husband is not forks over knives compliant, having to reorganize the pantry and fridge? Yeah, so totally understand that, Shauna. You're in the same boat as a lot of other people who, live with other people who aren't necessarily adhering to that plan or to that lifestyle, and that's perfectly fine. What we like for people to do when they're at this step is just to kind of pause, take a deep breath. We're not asking you to completely redo it if it doesn't make sense for you, but if you can take some concrete steps, handful of concrete steps to move forward, and explain in your narrative, in your submission to us, hey, I live with a person, my partner, who's not forks over knives or plant-based. Here's my effort, and we'll give you some guidance and feedback for yourself. Just more important that I think you explain your situation and can articulate that to us. Here's a book recommendation from Catherine. It's Forks Over Knives, a book called Flavor from Darshana Thacker. So excellent book. Good suggestion there. Vicky asked, what exactly is a food anthropologist and how do we get into that area of study? So, so my background is as a chef and a food anthropologist. And, food anthropology is basically just the intersection of food and culture. So it's all those things that are implicated in that conversation around why we are what we eat and what things do we learn about a person, a culture, a society based on food, based on the decisions that we make about what we eat, how we grow it, and all the implications that stem from those decisions. In terms of doing it, people get into it via the formal study of anthropology. So I did my undergraduate and graduate work in anthropology. Specifically, you learn all about research methods and understanding cultures and all the issues around working with different people. So it's pretty exciting. Next question, what is your opinion on ceramic pans? I own a ceramic pan. They make a good surface for nonstick. They still need to be treated well with care, respect, but ceramic pans can absolutely make a good surface in the context of a nonstick style pan. Next question, where can I buy gluten-free bread that is actually really gluten-free without vital wheat gluten in it? So Marilyn, when you're shopping and you see gluten-free bread, if it's labeled gluten-free, it should be gluten-free. It shouldn't have vital wheat gluten in it. That's the opposite of gluten-free. That's full-on gluten. So it just seems like maybe you need to ask your store clerk where the gluten-free bread is located, and when you find it, just confirm by reading the ingredients, on the back, that it in fact is gluten-free. That should be almost in big red flashing lights on the package that is gluten-free, and of course not indicate anything that's clearly gluten containing on the package. Next question here. Hi, I'd like to know which egg white powder I can use for whipping egg whites. I have no idea where I can find it here in Germany. Thanks for your help. Egg white powder is available in most supermarkets, certainly in specialty food markets. If you just ask the person working at the store to help you, oftentimes they will direct you and bring you right to it, typically in the baking section. Next question, any good recipes for fundamental recipes with whole food, no oil, no sugar, tart crust, puff, croissant, bechamel, Rosalie? Hi, Rosalie. I would recommend that you go into our Essential Vegan Desserts course. It's going to be difficult to do a proper, puff or croissant or kind of a laminated dough without some sort of fat. But I would say that if you were to have any luck, it would be in our vegan desserts course, which you can learn about on our website. Next question from Mark here. I live in Canada. I am going to be able to substitute ingredients. Thank you for these live events. So Mark, absolutely. We give full ability for our students to substitute ingredients or to modify recipes, really based on personal preference or availability, based on season or like your location, and also based on a medical need. So absolutely feel free to make substitutions. What we typically ask people to do when they're in a task or an activity, making, preparing something and then substituting, is just explain to us in your narrative, in the submission of what you're sending us, explain to us what you're doing and why. And that gives our chef instructors the ability, upon receiving that submission, the ability to review it and say, great, I see that Mark is making these 3 modifications. He presents a really good argument. The solution he presents is a great fix. Awesome. It's a great way to learn. I would say that where people get into problems with modifying recipes is when it really changes the entire technique, the entire outcome, the intended use of that food or that dish. But certainly swapping one thing for the other, making a substitute, that's all good. Thank you so much, Chef Ken, for the information. That was really helpful from Yenny. Thank you for joining. Helena says, is a silicone mat better than parchment for roasting no oil veggies? I would say they're comparable. Some people just prefer to use parchment. They don't want to use silicone. That's perfectly fine. I use both. I just find parchment to be so easy, no cleanup. I don't have to deal with scrubbing the silicone Silpat mat afterwards or anything like that. So, both are fully acceptable. Next question here. Hello, Chef Ken. How can we use the techniques of professional cooking while preparing traditional dishes without losing local taste and aroma? Wow, that's a really, really interesting question, an important question, I'll say. Sort of the intersection of applying professional or proper or classical type techniques to local and traditional food. I would say, starting out, I'll say that, there are a lot of ways to cook in the world. They don't all hinge on, what we would call, technique from a classical context at Ruby. A lot of different modes of cooking, a lot of different reasons to cook, a lot of different types of outcomes that you want from cooking. So we don't want to paint a picture like cooking is a one-dimensional activity. It's got to be dynamic. It's got to be interesting. It's got to be something where you want that local flavor. You want that feeling of uniqueness or that feeling of a place or a season or a moment to come through. So don't lose that. Don't jeopardize losing that because you read in a book that the pan has to be at 185 degrees to properly saute. If you're sauteing at a lower temperature and it takes a little bit longer and the outcomes are a little different, great. If you're going a little bit higher on heat and you've got some additional texture, or you're edging into the category of, food being in that kind of highly browned, even edging into some bitterness state, but you're managing it, like that's great too. People always talk about what's right, what's wrong. Ultimately, it's what tastes good, what made sense. So I wouldn't worry about anything that feels local or traditional or specific, encroaching on those professional techniques. Those professional techniques, I would actually embrace. I would embrace both. Last question here for the day. Question from Mary. Hi, Ken. Having to do with end of season zucchini. Do we need to scoop out the seeds to toast, or do we just cut the chunks and put them in the sheet and roast? Just salt and pepper or different spices? Yes, they are the few mammoth ones. So I would say, when those zucchini get really, really big, the end of season zucchini, where the exterior skin becomes hard, almost like a winter squash, and the interior becomes maybe a little bit just not super dense. It almost seems a little bit watery, and the seeds get big. They get disproportionate. So, one thing to do would be when the seeds are really big, they can almost look like small pumpkin seeds. Those you can scoop out and wash and, separate all the seeds from all the debris and, toast those seeds. Toast them in a warm 300-degree oven for 20 minutes. You can put some tamari on them, season them up with some lemon juice, some black pepper, whatever you want, and they can taste good. And otherwise, those can be cooked, using dry heat and then stored, kind of toasted up. The zucchini itself, if it's really big and the texture is not great, roasting it's going to help it a little bit. Roasting is going to help concentrate the flavor a bit, take some of that moisture out, and that's not going to hurt it. I would say if it's really, really big and you're worried about texture, think about pureeing that. Think about making that zucchini as the base of a cream soup. Not fighting the texture, but embracing the texture. Otherwise, all you're going to do is basically spend your time being disappointed that giant zucchini never got crispy or never got full of flavor that you were trying to get to. But I feel you. I've got some mammoth zucchinis as well, and yeah, sometimes it's just a little bit of a head scratcher because they're so big and you have so many, you got to figure out something to do with them. But that does it for all the questions that we have today. Just wanted to thank all of you for joining us. It was really a great session. Went almost 2 hours today. Patrick, our producer, is probably relieved to jump off this live event. But thank you again. If there was a question we didn't get to, or if I referred you to our customer service team, please do reach out to them. We're always looking forward to hearing from you. And until next time, we look forward to seeing you in class. And happy cooking. Take care.